Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. If you're new to this podcast, every week I alternate between an interview with at least one guest and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. This week's podcast is an interview with Dan Schneider. In this particular episode, we discuss how Dan transitioned from being a math educator to computer science education, Dan's recommendations for designing spaces for educational experiences, some suggestions for expanding and diversifying computer science programs, how Dan's pedagogical approaches evolved over time through experimentation and reflection, the importance of listening to and working with kids in one-on-one context, and so much more. As always, there are a lot of links in the show notes, and you can find them by simply clicking the link in the description for the app that you're listening to this on, or by visiting jaredoleary.com. In this particular episode, you're going to want to check out the show notes because there are links to all the posters that Dan mentions that you can get for free. And these posters are excellent for demonstrating how diverse computer science, STEM, mathematics, engineering, etc. can be. So make sure you check those out. But let's now begin this interview with Dan introducing himself.
My name's Dan Schneider. I'm a computer science educator. For the last 5 years, I taught high school computer science in Tucson, Arizona. Started with AP computer science principles, and then I built our program out from there and added an introductory course that built off of Code.org Computer Science Discoveries curriculum. I taught AP Computer Science A using several different platforms. I taught another sort of advanced level computer science course that was really just what I wanted to teach. And so we did some A-frame things in there with web-based virtual reality, and we did some GitHub things and tried to do some like game design things in Unity, did some other virtual reality things with CoSpaces. So I did a lot of things there. And then one year I also taught an electronics class where we messed around with Arduinos and circuit playgrounds, and that was really fun too. Before that, I was a math teacher, and so I transitioned from being a math teacher to a computer science teacher pretty much because the AP Computer Science Principles course became available and I could teach that. And when I was a math teacher, I focused on math intervention. And so students who, under traditional settings had not really been successful in math, and then trying to find these alternative ways to get them successful. And I also worked a lot with English language learners and particularly refugee students that the school I was at had a high population of. I currently, as of like a week ago, have started work as a curriculum writer for Code.org. But I feel like nothing I'm going to say here is reflective of that. It'll all just be my work as a high school educator. And that's some things about me.
Your mention of the electronics course, it made me think of this. So I happened to receive like a physical copy of this book where I contributed a chapter to, and it was on electronic circuitry using circuit bending techniques to make music and sound with children's toys. I don't know if you're familiar with that approach to electronic circuitry or if you've heard of it.
No, that is brand new.
So what you do is you take like a children's toy, you pull off the case essentially, and this needs to be like something that's not plugged into a wall so you don't like electrocute yourself. It needs to be battery operated in small batteries. And so you take like a wire, you tap one end of the circuit, and then you just start touching other parts of the circuit to see if it makes a sound, or if while the toy is making a sound, you try and see if it changes the sound. And so you can do this to like change the pitch, to change like add an echo, reverb, like all sorts of like interesting sound effects on it. So what I'll do is I'll put some like links to that in the show notes if anyone's interested in it. It's a really like interesting nerdy way of looking at electronic circuitry through music.
That's really cool. I love that. That's great. I wonder what that would look like in the classroom. Pulling apart children's toys, just like Roald Dahl's worst dream. We're just like ripping faces off of bears and things like that. So yeah, that'd be really good. That's really cool.
Knowing your background, I'm curious, how did you get into computer science education in particular? Because you didn't start there.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that offered computer science courses. And so I was able to take AP Computer Science A. I think when I took it, it was AB. They had like the second level of the AP course. And I had a teacher who was just like, he had like 7 different classes in the schedule that only fit like 5 different periods. And he was just super overwhelmed. And I had a lot of empathy for this teacher trying to deliver computer science instruction to students and differentiate in the types of areas they wanted to go into, whether it was programming or networking or computer hardware and maintenance. Like it was just one guy for all of that. And so I saw that there was sort of like this need for more computer science teachers, and tangentially at the same time, like I'd also had a bunch of teaching experiences. I'd worked in summer camps and I worked with students and had like tutoring experiences and really enjoyed that. So teaching was something that was of interest to me. And I also really like programming. I really like computer science. It vibed with me, this idea of like solving puzzles and starting with nothing and making something really creative. So all those things came together for me to be like, I would love to teach computer science. And then I went to the university, and there was no way for me to become a computer science teacher. Like that pathway did not exist when I went to the University of Arizona. So I started as a computer science major, and I finished that. I got my major in computer science. But at some point I got an email that was like, hey, if you take 2 more credits, you can be a math minor. And then, so I was like, okay, that's cool. And then I got another email. If you take 2 more credits, you can be a math major. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then they're like, hey, if you do this other thing, you can be a math teacher. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to do that. So I became a math teacher sort of in proxy of being a computer science teacher. If I could have, I would have started as a computer science teacher, but that pathway doesn't exist at a university, and it doesn't really exist in a lot of places. Like at my alma mater, there still is no direct way for someone entering into that place to leave with a computer science education degree. So that's how I started in math. And then once the AP computer science principles course came out, started to be offered by the College Board, and I saw that it was a no entry level introductory experience meant to draw in as many students as possible. And it was very rare to have an AP course with no prereqs. I wrote the course proposal for my district and said, we should offer this and I want to teach it. And then from there, it just blew up and exploded.
So what advice would you give for people who are in another subject area who are just now coming into computer science?
I think, first of all, like you're not alone. There are so many folks entering from all sorts of different areas. A colleague of mine who I really respect here in Tucson, he was a former English teacher and now he's teaching computer science. You have a background in music education and doing computer science. So it's that you're not alone. And because you're not alone, it's important to like find your community. And so whether that's through like a Facebook group somewhere, or whether that's on Twitter, or going through a professional development experience and then keeping in touch. It's like Scratch has meetups and Code.org has their forums and CS Awesome has their Google groups, like finding your group of how you want to keep in touch with people. And then just relying on those lived experiences of teachers in the classrooms. It's hard to find other like more professional resources. This was like a struggle I had going from a math teacher to a computer science teacher. Is resources for math teachers are very robust. It's the National Center for Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM, has a journal and they have conferences and they publish books and they do all these things. And it was very hard to find an equivalent thing for computer science. Recently, like CSTA has started to kind of fill that bubble and like offer resources, and their conference is really awesome. But at the time, it was really hard to do that. I just had to find other teachers. That was like the number one thing.
Yeah, for me, there's this like approach of just grasping at whatever I could. So I'd find like random YouTubers who would talk through like a language or how to code something in particular. And like while I would take a bath, I'd just like watch YouTube videos of people explaining how to code in a different language or IDE or whatever. And like that was one of my ways that I learned, or signing up for like Udemy course or some of the online free courses from like MIT, just things like that.
I think that's like a double-edged sword. And like back to your other question about like, people transferring from these other disciplines into computer science, the way that computer science has been traditionally taught for a long time is not the best way to teach like anything. So when I think about my experiences as a student in computer science at the college level, like it's all teacher-centered, it's all direct instruction, it's all these things that like don't translate very well to a high school classroom. But pedagogy in science, in math, and English, like those types of strategies that you learn in these other disciplines, like you got to hold on to those. You got to figure out a way to translate those into computer science, which I think is like the really interesting question. Like you can give general advice of think pair share is a teaching strategy that works really well with students. A jigsaw works really well with students. Things that you've done before, your grading style in your previous classes. But then how does that map onto a computer science classroom is something that's hard to think about. And the struggle is that when you look at other folks who may have found success in teaching computer science, it's in environments that don't map into like the high school classroom. Like something that's a tension for me is that a lot of computer science research happens at SIGSI, and it happens around like university classrooms, which are very different than like K-12 classrooms. And so translating some of that research like doesn't always work. I mean, frankly, like the students that you get as you do those research studies are not representative of the students that I have in my classroom. Like there's gender imbalances, there's racial and ethnic imbalances, like just a lot of those things don't translate. And so you really just have to kind of like trust your instincts from those previous pedagogical experiences, like your role in leading discussions and figuring out how to put that into the computer science world. Because if you just trust like, the old professors of ways it's been done before, you're just going to lecture the whole time. Your kids will be bored.
Yeah, that's really important. So I'm curious if you're applying these different pedagogies and whatnot in your classroom pre-COVID, what would have looked like? in your math class versus in your CS class in terms of what would be similar, what would be different, or just in general, what would people see or experience if they were to walk into your class?
So I think pre-COVID, if you walked into my computer science classroom, I really value like the social interactions that are available between students and creating like a collaborative environment that's just like the default. So you would probably not see silence. Like you would hear things. You would hear students talking with each other. You would see students like kind of moving around if the classroom is capable of doing that. You would see at times it would be hard to tell where the teacher is. That's my favorite thing of like when an aide would come in with a pass, they'd have to like scan the room, and it's always a game of like, are they going to figure out who's the teacher? And sometimes they don't. They just give it to another student. They're just like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm going to give this to someone else. So that's like a really great piece of the classroom. And so a lot of that comes from just like my experiences working in like academic summer camps. I think everyone should have the opportunity to like teach at an academic summer camp because the things that you value are so different than in a traditional classroom because no one has to be there. So everyone is just there by elective, which means that like you kind of have to motivate them coming back. Like you want them to have a positive experience, which means creating like engaging lessons is tantamount. Like if you have a whole afternoon where all you're doing is like lecturing, because that's like the most efficient way you thought about of presenting the material, that you're going to lose all those kids. Like no one has to be there. They're going to go home and complain and be like, we didn't have any fun today. And then the other piece of it is like summer camps really emphasize the relationship, you know, both between you and the students with each other. So you really start to emphasize this idea of how do I get to know my students and leverage that into the classroom environment? And then also what situations can I create where students get to know each other and interact with each other in ways that like help build these social skills? And you're also not thinking about like standards or tests. Like you're only thinking about how do I know my students are learning what they need to do? And how do I make sure that they're like progressing in a way that feels valuable to them personally? And all those things are so different from like a traditional classroom. So all of that to say, like I carry a lot of that into what my class looks like. And so finding ways for students to interact with each other, finding ways to be like playful at times, finding ways for them to do projects that are like meaningful. All those kind of come from my experiences working at like academic summer camps.
So I have multiple questions related to that. So one, going back to what you're kind of saying, how it's difficult to apply research on university classes into like the K-12 setting. Like they're apples and oranges. There's a huge difference in terms of if somebody's electing to take a class versus if they're paying tens of thousands of dollars a year in tuition to attend a class versus when they're mandated to take a class. So I'm curious, how have you approached, like when you were a math educator, I'm assuming students were mandated to be in there because of the math requirements to graduate from high school. How did that approach differ from your elective classes where kids are choosing to be in your computer science classes?
Well, so some things are transferable in a way. So for example, in my experience as a math teacher, I will accept the premise of, you know, they're there mandatorily because they have to be, and I will raise the stakes. So the types of classes I taught, these were students usually the year that they had to take the high stakes test in Arizona. So it was very important that they passed this. And they were already in another math class. So they were in one math class, and then they also had me separately. So they had two math classes that year. And I taught this extra math class, and I was taking away an elective spot. So if they really liked band, I got to yank them out of band, and they were now in my class teaching math. And math is not, they have like a very negative self-image about math. And so they don't like it anyway. And now we're saying you're in two math classes, one of which is taking away an elective spot. So not only were they like mandated to be there, there was like a lot of anti everything, you know, like they are not interested in being in this class. And nevertheless, I got to work with these students, and they're all, you know, regardless of their own personas, both projected on them externally and that they've internalized themselves, like they're all brilliant kids and they're all great. And so a strategy that works really well in that environment that I carry with me in other places is realizing that like traditional methods just don't work, and you have to find a different way to go around it. So like if teaching math traditionally as the textbook prescribes or as I remember it, if that had worked, these students wouldn't be in this class, which means that by the nature of them being here, I need to find something that's like tangentially related, almost tricking them into like doing math. I kind of anecdotally called it like teaching sideways. So it's like they have like this brick wall that if you teach it the regular way, they'll just crash into the wall. But if you can find like this sideways path around the wall, then all of a sudden you've moved past it. And so that is transferable and applicable in especially like very abstract concepts in computer science. It's like tricking them into doing something that doesn't feel necessarily concretely related, but is now this activity or this task that we can reference that has all these tangential side effects of being related to this task that we're looking at. Like there's lots of ways to do like Boolean logic, like ands and ors and truth tables and things like that, without just doing a truth table, because truth tables are boring. But you can find lots of ways to do that that still get the point across of how this type of logic works, whether that's with cards or dice or 20 questions or things like that. You can still get that point across and then have this tangential effect of like, surprise, you've been doing this the whole time.
Right.
So that is like something that's like transferable from that environment. And so like in those situations where students are kind of being forced to be in the class, another thing that's like super important is, well, it's important all the time. It's just like building relationships, you know, like having a teacher who like believes in you and trusts in you and is willing to start fresh in so many different ways is super important for students in that context. And also in any other context, whether they've been mandated to be a part of the class or they've elected to be in the class, that part stays the same. My classes were always elective classes, like students could choose to take them, but also students needed full schedule. So sometimes students would just get placed into the classes, especially like my introductory classes. So in that sense, it still kind of feels like a mandatory class. Like they're there because they get the high school credit they need and they don't have as much sort of like motivation there. And so then I see it as like an opportunity to surprise. You know, it's like computer science is unique and interesting, I think, in that at the high school level or even the middle school level, you haven't formed an identity about it necessarily. So like by the time you get to high school, you think of yourself as like either a math person or you're not a math person. You're an English person, you're not an English person. You're this or you're that. You have like your own sense of identity based on your prior experiences. And computer science is a place where, because it's not offered so often all over the place, it's a chance at the high school level to like really reframe some of those identities. And students can create a whole new one of like, I can be successful at this. Even though I don't think of myself as a math person, I can do math in the context of computer science and not even realize that I'm doing it and have this positive association with myself being creative and solving puzzles in a way that is like empowering and can build self-esteem and just be really cool for students that we have in the room. So that's like the opportunity I see when it's a mandated class.
I can definitely see that with kids in particular. They haven't had experience with it, so they don't have positive or negative experiences with it, so you can kind of build off of it. But what's interesting with the experiences doing CS professional development, teachers, because they don't have that prior experience with it, a lot of them start with this negative self-image where they're just like, because I've never done this before, how do you expect me to teach this thing?
That's true. So I've also like facilitated professional development for teachers. So I've seen that too, like teachers who walk in. But I think if you can create that same sort of moment for teachers as well. And those are, I think, some of like the really powerful computer science teachers, like the ones who have gone through that process themselves and then are excited to bring that process to their students. Those are the teachers I'm most excited to see what they do in the classroom. The ones who, you know, found their own like new sense of identity of just like, oh, this is really cool and this is what I want to do. And I want to keep adding programs and keep doing more things. Those are the teachers I'm super excited by and the impacts they'll have on kids.
So we've previously talked about the importance of like the design of a space and how it kind of facilitates engagement and whatnot. So if you have like rows where every computer's all facing the front, like a screen, then that's more conducive to like lecture based versus like pods or whatever. Like how was your classroom space set up or open, and how did it kind of facilitate the engagements that you've been describing?
Yeah, so I like this question. So this is like something that I've kind of thought about and written about before. Both of my parents are involved in like interior design in some way. My dad's in construction and my mom did like interior design. So like attention to space is something that like I grew up with, and the sort of like subtle unintended consequences of like how space leads in certain ways. And I bring that into my classroom and just thinking about like what opportunities are available depending on how the room is arranged versus what opportunities aren't. In my ideal classroom, all the computers would be around like a ring around the edge of the room with open space in the middle that sometimes they really could have tables. Tables would be like the best thing to have in there. Then I could facilitate either like unplugged lessons that happen sort of in the middle of the room, or I could facilitate like, you know, pair programming, plugged lessons that happen around the edge of the room, and having the freedom to kind of move between both of those is like my ideal environment in terms of just how that facilitates like lessons and things like that. My classroom was not set up like that. My classroom was set up in like pods and like a very confined space. And because it was so confined, once students sat down, it was hard for them to like get back up. Like the chairs would back into each other. We had a rule where you couldn't like I didn't let them bring their backpacks into the classroom because it literally just took up too much space. Like they would like trip over them and things like that. I had a very defined path of where I could walk in the classroom. That's another really interesting thing. Like when I was becoming a teacher, I had like a mentor who one day watching me teach, all they did was just draw where I moved in the room. And that was so insightful. Like if you ever get the opportunity to have someone do that for you, that's just like, you learn so much about like your presence as a teacher of just like what paths you get to and what places you don't get to at all. So because of these classroom limitations, I started to adapt. I invested a lot in creating like these little, like supply stations at the tables for students so that they never needed to stand up. It's like, you didn't bring your pencil with you. Well, there's a pencil in this little box that you can grab. You don't have paper with you and you need some. Well, there's scratch paper in the middle you can grab. You need whiteboards. It's in the middle that you can grab. And I even brought that into like distributing and collecting handouts, which is something that we lose like so much time for. And like, if you add up all the minutes in the classroom, just I'm passing out a paper to every single student, big waste of time. And so I started having like these folders in the middle of my pods where if I knew ahead of time that I need to give them something, I just put however many copies I needed in that folder. And it's like, all right, you're gonna need this handout, open the folder and grab it. There you go. Everyone gets one. Or if I need to collect papers, it's like, all right, put them in the folder. And then I can just like grade them in the folders and put them back. That's like a nice little classroom hack if you have pods and things like that. And so that's sort of like what my space necessitated. But the other big thing that I started to focus on and realize it had to do with my desires to get as many students as I could in the room. And there are some students who are more inclined to enroll in a computer science course, mainly just like white males. If you let everything fall the way it may, statistically, you're more likely to have a classroom full of white males than you are of anything else. And I didn't want that. I wanted like the students in my classroom to represent the students in my school, which was a lot of like Latinx students and Black students and some Native American students. And so I really wanted that to be part of my classroom. And so in looking up ways that happens, NC WIT has a lot of like resources behind that. And like Girls Who Code published a report about it. And like Microsoft has like as like a guide where they've gathered a bunch of resources, also mostly from NC WIT, on ways to help do that. And in reading over all those, the biggest thing that I saw was just how impactful it can be for students to see themselves in computer science roles and how to see themselves in the space that they want to move into. When you walk into my room, there's like a wall on the left side as soon as you walk in. And I just started covering that with posters of diverse computer scientists, Black computer scientists, Native computer scientists, Pacific Island computer scientists, and not just computer scientists, just like scientists and mathematicians and just like important folks in general. And so I pulled from like code.org has a set of resources. CSTA just published some posters. CS in San Francisco, CS in SF has like a cultural heritage page that's really great. There's a podcast called Nevertheless that did like this beautiful poster series that's like 8 women that like did all these like great things in like Mae Jemison's on it, who was like the first African-American female astronaut. And so what's cool about those posters is they were just like STEM posters. So there were some computer scientists, but also mathematicians and scientists. And I got my school to make copies of them, multiple copies, and I got them laminated. And then I just gave them to other STEM teachers. It was like, you should put these up in your room too. And I have them in my room, you have them in your room. And like students noticed that all of a sudden there was this better representation showing up on our walls and showing up in our schools. And I have these great pictures of some students just like staring and reading the wall and all these different posters I had just showing all these different Black computer scientists, Latin American computer scientists, Native computer scientists, and it was very cool.
So that's great for people who are in the classroom, but what about the people, like if there's computer science educators who like have a small number of kids who want to increase the size of their classes? So like maybe they're only teaching one unit, they want to teach like their entire course load on just computer science. So how do you recruit kids to even want to consider that as an elected class?
Again, this idea of like, you can't be what you can't see, and like using like representation to be a part of that. So like getting the students you currently have to help go out and recruit for you. And then adding on to that, the power of like a personal invitation. And so like that's part of like the research too, is that having like a personal touch and a personal contact and extrapolating that to this idea of like mentors. Like there's research in there that shows that like that is super impactful too. And one of the biggest reasons I think about those is just because like for me, they're like low lift, like printing out a bunch of posters and putting them on my wall did not take me very much time, but has a huge impact to the students who walk in and see those. Asking some of my students to say, hey, here's like a little flyer about my class. Like think of 5 of your friends who aren't in this class and go invite them to this class and give them this little flyer. That's very low lift for me and arguably low lift for those students. Yet it potentially has like this huge impact on the students that I want to recruit into the class. The other thing is like being intentional and like leveraging your fellow teacher connections. So I like would ask like some of the math teachers and things like that if I could go into their classrooms and recruit students and like make my pitch and things like that. And something I did that not a lot of the other elective teachers would do is I also went into like the resource classrooms. So we have like students who have IEPs, students who are part of like the special education program. They're sometimes in resource classes for whatever their specific learning disability is. And they still take electives and they're great. And I had noticed that like students who have IEPs in my class when I was teaching computer science would do amazing, perhaps in contrast to the experiences that other teachers had. And so that was like this really amazing resource that I could bring those students into my classes. And so I went and recruited in those classrooms and a bunch of them signed up the next year. And it was great. Like, again, that idea of like, who you are as a student, like what's your self-perception, to step outside of that and make something creative in computer science is super validating and super expanding.
And the courses that you had several different options that people could kind of self-select into what they're doing. So when you were sending out the personal invitations and whatnot, did you list like, hey, if you're interested in this, here's a course related to that. Or if you're interested in this other thing, here's this other course, as opposed to here's one course offered 5 different times throughout the day?
Yeah. And so the way that my school is structured, there was kind of like 2 entryways into like an introductory course. And one of them was like this introductory computer science discoveries-esque course where we did more web design stuff. And this last year I added in like some virtual reality, augmented reality stuff that was really fun. And we do 3D printing because that's really cool. So there's that class. And then there's also the AP Computer Science Principles class. And so, I'm really grateful that I had a class that wasn't labeled AP, because that's also something that's triggering both to students and unfortunately to counselors. So like when you see that AP label, that sometimes boxes in students. It just like says like this is for this type of student and not for these other types, which is not true. And so trying to change that perception was an ongoing process. But in the meantime, I had this other non-AP introductory course that students could jump into. And that was one I pitched as like more of kind of like creativity and coding and problem solving. And then the AP course is one that's, it's with computer science principles. Like we focused on like real impacts of technology, and we still did like programming and like impacts on society. And that was like the 2 kind of areas where I pitched those courses. And students could enroll in both. And this last year I had one student enroll in both of them, and that was really fun too.
So I'm curious, going back to like the way that you facilitated classrooms and whatnot, how did it change when it went to virtual or online experiences with COVID?
Yeah, so that was tough to think about. So I think the biggest struggle was just the inherent inequity of it all, purely in terms of just like access to time to work on things, access to technology to work on things, access to like internet access. And then access to like kind of like individuality, like so many students like shared computers with siblings and things like that. Oh, I'll also say this is important context. I think Arizona ends school much earlier than the rest of the nation. So when COVID started to hit and the impact started to really be felt, we only had like a month left in school. We had already finished most of the 3rd quarter and like kind of like halfway through the 4th quarter. And so a lot of the concerns that other folks had regarding like grading and things like that weren't as pressing. It was more just about managing this impending trauma that was coming through. And so some ways that my course changed is like, I just tried to be as available and empathetic and continue those relationships with students that I developed throughout the year and keep in touch with them. The project shifted to things that were like more creative and more that you could complete kind of independently. Several students didn't have access to computers, so I put together like packets, like unplugged activities that they could complete at home. We did a lot of things with like pixel art that you could kind of color in, which was really cool. And then for my AP classes, they had those AP exams to just get ready for. That was a whole big thing that we had to get through. So like in terms of how my classroom changed, I just became a lot more focused on the relationship piece, because I knew that some teachers would not do it very well. Some teachers would not adjust at all to what was happening. It's like we did something different every single day, and you were going to do the same thing every single day. And I knew that not everyone could handle it as gracefully as I had the capacity to, because I had already built up the infrastructure of kids on Google Classroom and having ways to keep in touch with me. And I just gave them a lot of grace to deal with perhaps other situations that they couldn't control.
Yeah, and for context for why Arizona ends earlier than others, we're in July right now, and it's 116 here in Phoenix. So
We also start earlier. Like we're at the end of July, and some schools are already back in session.
oddly enough. So I'm curious, with the different pedagogies and approaches that you described, are there any like philosophies or named pedagogies or like even just experiences that kind of informed why you do the way that you do? Like you mentioned for design, your parents having a background in design and whatnot, but what about with facilitating educational experiences or even designing the experience itself?
So I think that's a tough one for me to reflect on because the things that I've like emphasized and like where I've wanted like what philosophies or pedagogies or things like that I've prescribed to, they have shifted as I've matured as a teacher. And so like I almost think of it as there's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of teaching. You know, it's like Maslow's hierarchy for like human existence. You know, you got to start at that base level of like shelter and food and water. And then I forget the other levels. Like there's a level above that that's like I don't know. I remember like some of the higher levels are things like personal relationships and like, you know, being social and things like that. And then it's sort of like this like higher level like meditative like fulfillment. But there's like this hierarchy of like human needs and desires and things like that. When you've accomplished one level, then you internally are motivated to like move on to the next level. So once you feel sufficient with like food and water and things like that, you start looking for like personal fulfillment. And then when you feel good with that, you start looking for like social fulfillment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I feel the same way about teaching, where it's like you have at the bottom, you know, when I was first starting off as a teacher, I found myself just like I needed to know classroom management. And then once I knew classroom management, like nothing else mattered until I had classroom management. So I would read things that had to do with like classroom management and like and interacting. And so like I remember I like someone gave me like the Harry Wong like first days of school, and I was just so overwhelmed. Like that was a terrible thing to give to like a first year teacher because it makes you feel like if you don't set the tone right in the very first day, the whole year is ruined. The way I would design things were really based around just trying to get a handle on like classroom management. And then after that, once I felt like I got the hang of that, I would start thinking about like instructional designs, like how am I delivering lessons? What scaffolds am I giving students during the lessons? How am I sort of interacting with students, creating like social environments and things like that? And then once I got the hang of that, I started to think about like assessment, like how am I assessing students? How does the things I value in my grading system impact the way that students complete assignments and things like that? And one difference I think between like Maslow's hierarchy and this that I'm describing is like every time I move up a hierarchy as a teacher, I have to like totally revisit and reevaluate everything that I had done before. So like when I'm grading, when I was looking at like grading and what am I valuing with grading, you know, maybe for a long time I had points related to just like compliance and just like showing up and participating because that helped me with classroom management. And then as I evolved as a teacher, I realized, oh, that's a terrible thing for grading because then like my assessment systems like don't really value those things. So all of that to say, in my most recent sort of like reflections on being a teacher, and if I were to start building things into my pedagogy, now it has to do with like kind of like culturally responsive teaching and like honoring like student identity and pieces like that. And it's tough because when I look at that, I realize how many things from like my prior experiences I have to dismantle. So like, for example, when learning how to like interact with students and like do discussions and things like that, Teach Like a Champion came out when I was still like learning to be a teacher. And so for a long time, that was like how I based things. And now when I look at it from this lens of like student identity and like culturally responsive, it's not that great of a book. Like there's things to look at that really deserve like a critical lens. And so I have to like undo those things and change the way my lessons were and change the way my assignments were and like unpackage all of this machinery I built up when I was focused on different things. So if I were to think about like what pedagogies I ascribe to with philosophies, at this point, it would be like ways to like honor student voice and student choice, not shying away from tough conversations that have to do with like student agency and identity and bringing their world into the classroom. Like the things we do in the class should be directly connected to things that they experience in the world. And especially in this computer science context, like this idea of like identity and bias and how the work that we do as computer scientists is sort of related and a part of that work. And those are things I was not focusing on in the earlier parts of my teaching. And my assignments did not leverage those pieces. And I feel like if I was still in the classroom, I'd be like unpacking all of that.
So I don't know if this will make you feel any different about your reflections on that, what you just said, but so I took a teacher education research course for my doctorate like 6 or 7 years ago or something. So I forget who it was that studied this, but there's a lot of teacher educators who research identity development of teachers over time and how it changes. And like the things that you focus on when you first start is typically, like you said, like the classroom management stuff. And then eventually gets to, okay, the content, and then it gets to the delivery of the content. And then eventually it gets to, okay, you're working with human beings and you focus on them as individuals. Months, if not several year process to get from focusing on the classroom management to actually realizing that you're working with human beings. So your mention of like books that like may have been helpful at the time, it was for that place where you were. And like myself, that very resonated with me. I like, it was the book Teaching with Love and Logic. Like that one, when I first started teaching, like I went with that and was like, oh, this is cool. But then eventually, like I look back on that and go, no, I wouldn't do that again. And here's why. So yeah, that definitely relates to it. And there's this music ed scholar who wrote a chapter and coined the term methodolatry. And it's where you like buy into a method of doing something and like you only will do that thing at the cost of like everything else. And so like there's this problem where some people, when they go into education, like they buy into like constructivism or constructionism or something, and like that's all I'm going to do, and I'm going to ignore everything else out there. And it's like, but our understanding of how we learn in education is constantly evolving and whatnot. So like on that like general theme, one of the things that I like to ask is like, when you first started, what was something that you first believed that you now look back on and go, okay, no, I don't believe that anymore?
It's that if you put a lot of work into thinking really carefully about your assignments in terms of like how they're categorized and how they're weighted and like how frequently you're going to do this, like you do a lot of preparation in terms of being very systemic about how your grades are set up and your tests are weighted and things like that. If you do a lot of prep work in that, then you can be confident that you have an objective system for how grades are like measuring students. Like if you've thought very intentionally about how much I'm going to weight tests and quizzes and how many opportunities I'm going to have for this and that, like confidence that like you have like some sort of like objective system.
Yep.
And I do not believe that that's true ever. And an experience I have that like relates to that if I could go back, I would do differently 100%, was in my very first year of teaching. I was teaching like a sophomore level math class, and I had a senior in that class who was like retaking it. And the senior like had lots of other stuff going on and could only come to class like inconsistently. And so would miss lots of things and things like that. And in like the last week of school came back and was like, like, hey, I need to pass this class. Like, what can I do to pass this class? And I looked at my grade book, which I thought I'd set up in this perfect way. And I'm like, well, if you get a minimum of like these two high scores, they were like close to A's on like these two tests and the finals, then that will bring your grade up to a passing grade. And then you'll be able to like pass the class and graduate. And that student did not get a passing grade on those tests. Instead, he got like mid B's on those tests, going in cold, having like missed most of the semester. And I said, I've set up this grade book to be objective. It did not measure it right. I'm not going to give this person a passing grade. And in retrospect, that's like the stupidest thing I could have done, because like they didn't get like this arbitrary point that I had set, but the students still got like high B's on knowing the content and knowing what needed to do. And I think that actually like that was like a turning point in like my reflection of thinking about grades. But like that's something that for a while I thought about, of just like, if you do a lot of things to set up the system could be objective. And as I say that right now, that just sounds so wrong. There's so many things about that wrong, both in terms of teaching and just the world that we live in.
I laugh because like I had a very similar perspective on it. And for me, the catalyst was a professor who asked a question, something like, what happens when it takes somebody 11 weeks to learn the content in a 10-week course? So like they achieve complete mastery on the 11th week, but the course ended on the 10th week. So what do we do about that? And like just realizing, oh, well, we're all learning differently. And like talking about the more like social, emotional learning involved, like what's going on with everybody right now with COVID. And even before that, just life in general, people needing breaks and time away from school. Even when they want to be there, they can't, etc. So I'm curious, like that teachable moment for you, how have you tried to replicate that in your own teaching with kids?
It's both like providing opportunities for flexibility and then also providing opportunities to like listen to students and hear context. Like that, I think was definitely a blind spot for me in that moment, is that I didn't have the capacity to like really listen to the student and hear everything that was going on. Like To me, it was you're like a number on the paper, like these are your absences and this is your grade. And I just did not have the capacity for empathy, just being overwhelmed with everything I was doing in my first year. So like really listen to that student. And so ways that's translated now is like trying to find opportunities to like listen to students, believing that they want the best for themselves. And if there's actions that are being taken that don't go in that direction, believing that it's just because like they don't know like the right steps to take. They don't know how to communicate it. They don't know how to bring it up with someone. They don't feel safe telling it to me, but they feel safe telling it to someone else. Like ultimately everyone wants to like move forward and do well in their own like sense of doing well. And just finding opportunities for me to like listen to students and honor that. And then being flexible in my grading and finding opportunities to make things up, even past the semester, like to your point about like the 11 weeks versus the 10 weeks. I was fortunate enough to work at a school that like very much so honored this idea of like, you know, you can go back and do a grade change if someone has like made up that work and shown progress at that particular time. Like that's very much so like a real thing. Deadlines are just like arbitrary. You know, most of the time, if like we set like a deadline, a lot of it's just for us, so we don't have to like go back and grade extra work. And it's very real, but that doesn't mean that like you can't listen to a student and make some other type of plan around that. Another very tangible thing that happened is like I started adding a category in my grading system that was just everything else. So instead of trying to like categorize everything, it's like we got quizzes and tests and projects and then everything else. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's homework, maybe it's classwork, maybe it's, you know, stuff we do, maybe it's something I haven't even thought about yet. But you know, that's just a piece of your grade too, is this like everything else.
So I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about like your changes and approaches over time. How have you like iterated or essentially practiced as an educator or as a computer scientist?
So this is another plug for like summer camps, because there's like no stakes in summer camps. So if I wanted to try out a particular like pedagogy strategy or something like that, I could do it with like these kids. And if I messed it up, we'll go take a break and come back in and we'll just try something else. And so like I would test a lot of things and get things wrong a lot, kind of working at these like academic summer camps, which was like a real thing. So for example, I wanted to try out this teaching strategy called PRIM, which is like predict, run, investigate, modify, make. And it's for like teaching new syntax and things like that. And I thought it was really cool. And I didn't want to just like plan like lesson after it. So I happened to be teaching an academic summer camp. And I was like, I'm going to try teaching this to you this way. Let's see how it goes. And then I could like iterate from there. So like having like safe spaces to do that, you know, throughout the academic year, that could be like a coding club that you run with students, or it could be sort of like weekend workshops or something, like give opportunities for students to learn computer science outside of the classroom. And then you get to practice, you know, your pedagogy as well, which is like super cool.
Me being a musician, like I'm constantly thinking of like ways to refine my abilities as a musician, but that also can be applicable in my abilities in computer science or as an educator.
A lot of like reflecting and also like data gathering, like asking students like, how is this going? How have you liked this so far? Like, how does this feel? And like check-ins on like new pedagogy and like reflecting on that. And like the place that I do a lot of that is like I've kept like a blog for a long time. Like I had it when I was a math teacher, and now I have it like a little bit as a computer science teacher. And I don't really like promote it a whole lot anymore because it's not necessarily for like other people. Like it's there for me. Like that's where I'm like reflecting on and compressing, and it serves as like a timestamp for me as I'm like working through different things. And that's been really important for like my practice of just like reflecting on how things have been going and ways to improve. And sometimes in writing those reflections, like I figure it out, I get unstuck. Same thing with coding. Like when you talk to a rubber duck, I'm just talking to a blog post.
Yeah, and the idea of experimenting with your pedagogies and whatnot, that really resonates with me. One of the things that I would constantly do is be like, hey, I'm going to try out this new thing today. Let's just see how it goes and give me your feedback and we'll experiment. Another thing that I really valued was I had the opportunity, like in music education in particular, to work one-on-one. Like we're going to play drum set, or I'm going to teach you how to do marimba. And then all the way up to like, I'm working with 150 kids all in a marching band setting, and like I'm running the entire rehearsal kind of a thing. So like knowing the different approaches when you're working with somebody one-on-one versus when there's 150 kids in front of you, like having that ability to kind of like go from small to large group and whatnot, that has also been helpful for me. And experimenting in all those like in-betweens.
You know, and I think, you know, you said something that's important too, is just like the ability to be vulnerable and just be like, we're trying this out. We're going to see how it goes. And depending on like the relationships you have with students and the culture you've created, like sometimes folks are into that and sometimes they're not. I usually don't do that with like my intro classes first. Like usually students I've had for a couple of years, I'm comfortable being like, hey, we're going to try this thing out. And like, we'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow. Maybe we won't. We're going to figure this thing out together. And that's how I've landed on like some things that I think have been really successful in my practice, by like iterating with response from students and hearing students and them knowing that they're a valuable part of like that feedback process too.
Yeah, and a lot of the experimentation that I've done has been based on research, but also another good chunk of it has just been based on like intuition and like the kids that I'm working with, and just like, let's just try this thing. I just came up with this idea. Let's just see how it works. I've never seen anyone do it before, but we'll see how it goes.
And like the other thing that makes me think of is my first year teaching, I taught geometry, and that's all I taught, 5 sections in a row, all geometry. And because it was my first year teaching, the way I taught the lesson the first period was usually never the same as when I taught it the last period. Like by the time I got to the end of the day is when I was like, oh, okay, I figured out how this lesson goes. So that was like a big part of iterating when I was like teaching geometry. It was just like, oh, like I know immediately this lesson did not go very well. And so I can start making adjustments as I repeat it. And that's also one of the things that I think is like tough about computer science, is a lot of times you're siloed and you only teach the lesson like once, and then you just have to like go with that, and you don't have that chance to iterate on it. Like that was something I missed transitioning from like math to computer science, is like so often you just have one class of one type, and then you have to like mentally code switch after you teach a lesson into like the other lesson for the other type of class. And so you don't get that like iterative and reflective moment as easily. You have to really work at it to try and do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like when I taught general music, if there were 5 fifth grade classes, I would teach the same lesson that week 5 times. And sometimes I would teach it in the same way, like literally one class, and then I teach the exact same lesson to the very next class that walk in the door, and it'd be night and day in terms of reception. And so that's when I realized like, oh, well, if they have a pizza party right before coming to your class, that's going to change things, and if they don't. So like having that like A/B test like really helped me out to understand that it's not always my fault if a lesson doesn't go well, even though I like to think of the things that I can do to improve it, even when it's like heading down that path. It's sometimes it's out of your control.
So speaking of like moments where I wish I could go back and change things, and also like moments when I should have listened to students and didn't, was like in one of like my math intervention classes, we had like a quiz scheduled that day. And so I was like, all right, here's how we do quizzes. You sit here and you do this and you do that, and you're going to carceral pedagogy, and you're going to sit here and do it like this. And a kid came in late, and he had like a little bag. We had a photo class at our school and usually held like a camera, and there was just something very off about what was happening. And like everyone kind of noticed, and I didn't care. I was like, you're late, we're taking a quiz, sit down, and you're going to take a quiz. And just everyone was distracted, and I was annoyed because everyone was distracted. And come to find out, like a little later in taking the quiz, this kid had like found a kitten on campus, and the kitten was in that little bag. And so no one was like paying attention. And if I just stopped and like had a conversation with that student and been like, what's going on? What's happening right now? We could have like done better things for that kitten. And like, I could have just like salvaged that moment, and then we could have actually taken the quiz. Like that's 100% me just feeling locked into a way of doing things that I didn't have to be. There was no reason for me to do that. Stop and listen to kids. That's all you got to do.
Yeah, I've got many examples similarly in terms of just things I reflect on and go, oh, I wish I would have done that differently. Like if I only knew then what I know right now.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of educators don't actually stay in the field after like the 3 and even like 5-year mark. And so I'm curious, how have you kind of tried to stave off that burnout and the overworking that comes with being in education, and especially when it comes to being in something like computer science, where you can always learn more. There's always another language, another IDE, another platform, etc.
For me personally, I think a big part of that is just within my niche and within my field, just always finding for like a new opportunity. Like a really good way to get me to do something is to say like, hey, do you want to do this thing no one's ever done before? And so like in my career, like I started with teaching just regular math classes. And then after a couple of years, I had the opportunity to teach like intervention math classes. And then after a couple of years, I had the opportunity to teach like English language learners and refugee math classes, which was a whole other amazing thing. And then after a couple of years, I started teaching computer science. And then after a couple of years, I started like expanding the program, or throughout that time, expanding the program. So I was always able to like jump to the next thing. And I think that's how I survived. Because if I had continued to teach the same class over and over again, I would have gotten bored.
Okay, yeah.
And like that's tough. I mean, the students are new every day, and I love that every day feels different. Like no matter what, every class is different, every student is different. Like that unpredictability is very exciting of being in a classroom, but you feel like you lose out on problems to solve. It's like, how do I teach this one concept in a way that students get it? And like after a couple years, it's like, oh yeah, I can just like rely on these lessons. Like I started to feel it with like my AP Computer Science Principles course after teaching it for like the 4th year. I could just glance at the lesson plans and be just like, oh yeah, that's right. Here's how I do this thing. And so I wasn't always like motivated to learn to like adjust that. But I do think, as I was saying, like as my focus shifted into things like student identity and culturally responsive pedagogy, like that would have motivated me to go back and like stay in the field to do a better job that way. Like that's a regret I have right now, that I can't like retool some of those lessons to just be better at like honoring students. But if you never are forced to confront those things and make those adjustments, like if you never move above that like hierarchy of what you're focused on, like if you spend your entire teaching career just focused on classroom management, yeah, you get burnt out, you never evolve, and then you never have a reason to like, puzzle and unpuzzle yourself in how do you create the best lesson that there is.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I was in the classroom in the coding classes in the makerspace, like every week I'd be exploring something new. Every day there was something new, and I'd be sharing like, hey, here's this new project that I worked on this past week. What are you going to work on this week? But when it came to music classes, the district that I was in for general music in particular, the lessons were mandated. If one of the 5 administrators that I had walked in and spot checked and I wasn't teaching the specific lesson on the specific day, I'd get like slapped on the wrist or written up for it. And so like that I would have gotten burnt out on very quick, and I did. But when it came to computer science, like it was refreshing because like every day it could be this new thing. But what about like outside of that? Like, because that can be overwhelming in terms of it never ends. Like, how do you take a break from that? Or do you not?
So the other piece that kind of kept me going and kept me, again, it's this idea of like, this isn't always very appealing to like some teachers, but teaching in a different context than just the classroom. So things like running a Girls Who Code club, or doing like a 2 or 3 week summer camp, like academic summer camp environment, where you're like teaching things that you hopefully like, to students who want to be there. And like you get, again, because it's not in the classroom, it's more fun. Like you get to build those relationships with students. You get to focus on the things you want to. Like something that I was doing and would still do to like avoid burnout is teach in context outside of a classroom. And I think that's very refreshing. Like if you're in teaching because you love teaching and you love working with students and things like that, those contexts help remind you of those things. I think that's super important. I also think like in the world of just like, all these computer science educators, like folks, who've just gotten into computer science and they're teaching some courses and they want to get better at computer science themselves, or they want to get better at teaching computer science, like they spending at least one summer just like teaching in these programs. Folks will pay you to do this, which is pretty good. That's like the best professional development I think you can do, is just having this opportunity to teach in different ways to different students in different contexts and see how that feels and see how you grow from that. I think is really powerful.
What research in particular do you feel like would help you grow right now? Or do you feel that is lacking in the field?
I think any computer science research would help me grow because it's not something that's ever been on my radar. Like as a math teacher, there's things you can read about like constructivist math techniques, or 5 practices of mathematical habits, or like 5 practices of mathematical conversation. Like there's things you can read about in the math world of like what research is and what that looks like, that you see when you become a math teacher and you're exposed to by like the professional organizations you're a part of. I don't see that. I have to find it as a computer science teacher. So like on Twitter, I'm working with behind the scenes. I'm working with another educator named Jen Manley, and we're starting these like Talk CS Ed research chats where every week we like read a piece of research and like talk about it with other educators. And that's been super helpful for me because it doesn't matter what we read. It's all new. It's all something different. Tangentially, also like listening to your podcast when you like break down those research articles has also been like super useful. It almost doesn't matter what it is that I'm looking at, just anything, because I have my own intuitions of what good teaching is. And I don't know if those are correct. And if they are correct, I don't know why. Those are the types of things that I need to be like a better CS educator.
You have listened to the Unpacking Scholarship episodes and it has helped with that. But are there other things that I can do? Have intentionally shifted directions and focused on equity and inclusion for several episodes that either have already released or will be released soon. And that's going to be something that's going to continue to happen while talking about other topic areas. But are there other areas that I might not realize are blind spots that could help the community?
Pivoting to a focus on like equity and inclusion and like getting diverse voices on these podcasts, like Black educators, Latinx educators, Native educators, like getting those folks here, I think is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw like Leon Tynes, another Arizona educator, just did that CS for All Teachers Computing While Black webinar, which was really great. So the way I was taught computer science is not the way that I would like to teach computer science. Anything that helps to shift that narrative, I think is good.
So you mentioned like getting students to recruit and the one-on-one connection and like connecting with teachers and counselors who can kind of help you out. Do you have other suggestions related to improving like equity and inclusion in CS that you might give as advice to other educators?
I don't have immediate thoughts in this moment regarding recruiting students into the classroom. I think some of the things I said before are big. There's so many things that are, when you think of low lift, high impact, like those are the things I look for. And so like representation is something that like any teacher can put posters on their wall and have that available for students. Any teacher can have like a meaningful conversation with students to try and get them into the classroom, like versus like trying to convince your administration to like expand the computer science program, for like these reasons. That's a harder lift. It's valid, but it's tougher. Like, what are the low lift things you can do? That's generally how I think about recruiting. But your question made me think about like, what are some other things? I recently had like the opportunity to like speak. I presented like the CSTA conference a couple of times, and I'm going to like present in like a couple of other places. And I think something that like CS educators can do who are in those spaces of offering workshops or presenting or being asked for these things is to take a step back and ask, who is the audience that this is being presented for? And am I the right person to be saying this message? Are there other people who can present this message better? And can I invite them up or make room for them? So like I co-presented with two people at CSTA, and I'm so happy that I did because one, they're friends and they're amazing and they're awesome. But also then folks who didn't know who those educators are now know who those educators are. They're Kelly Lougheed and Jeff Olson, and they're amazing. And they are folks that folks should check out and go see. And so if I'm now asked to like present or speak somewhere, I'll ask, if I'm on a panel, like who else is on this panel? If it's all like white males, I don't think I want to be a part of that. Or who's being invited to this conference? Like, how is space being made for like a diverse group of educators to show up here? How is space being made for like this equity and inclusion effort? And how can I contribute to that? And in some ways, I think it's like creating space to have like a co-presenter who comes with me, or just declining and recommending other people in different places. That is something that I think we as a CS education community can think about. And that's also reflective of like, that's been like a problem in the math ed community. As we're speaking right now, like there's lots of little like things that bubble up all the time on Twitter of just like these panels that are meant to be like folks talking to math educators. And it's like all white folks and there's no teachers on the panel and things like that. And we can do better.
Do you have any questions for myself or questions for the field?
Sure. Here's a question for the field. For folks who are involved in like CS educator, like teacher training and preparation, things like that. So there are a lot of amazing CS educators who have recently come into CS education from other backgrounds. They used to be English teachers, math teachers, business teachers, music teachers, and they are presented with and teaching courses that they can follow along with and work with along with students. And they can take on these roles as facilitators and help develop that understanding like along with students. What are the next steps for those teachers? How does someone increase your pedagogical knowledge or your CS content knowledge? What spaces are there in the CS education professional development field for that to happen? In my experience, when I was looking for similar opportunities, I had gone through like professional development that was focused on a specific curriculum. And then if I wanted to either be better at pedagogy or better at computer science, I either had to take PD from another curriculum provider that I didn't care about because I already knew the curriculum I was going to teach, or I had to take like graduate level courses at my university in computer science, or I just had to take undergraduate courses in computer science to just learn more computer science. And neither one of those are good choices for teachers in the field. So like, what opportunities are there for you to become a better computer science teacher beyond your first introduction to like, here's the Scratch curricula, here's the CS Awesome curricula, here's the whatever curricula, like what opportunities are we creating for those teachers? That's a question I have for the field.
Yeah, I like that. It would be interesting to have more opportunities for pedagogy rather than focus on content and platform in terms of professional development offerings. So before going into computer science, I was looking into micro-credentialing and just thought it was a fascinating idea and whatnot, like demonstrating competency, but then also thinking of it, well, it doesn't really get at the point of education in terms of growth. It's not just, can you demonstrate understanding? It's, are you developing a deeper understanding of starting wherever you're at and going to somewhere else? But when it comes to like certification and whatnot with computer science education, I totally understand how, like myself being a classroom teacher coming from one subject area to another, doing micro-credentialing like Arizona's doing and Wyoming's doing, like things like that, that makes things a whole lot easier to be able to kind of like pick and choose a la carte the things that you want to focus on. Maybe you'll study pedagogy more, maybe you'll study specific languages or platforms and whatnot. But yeah, I like that question. So where can people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Mathy McMatherson. There's no N at the end, but if you start typing it, Twitter will cut off the characters. I had a blog, a math blog that's still up for a long time that I don't update anymore, but it's like 4 years of me being a math teacher. That's mathymcmatherson.wordpress.com. And when I became a computer science teacher, I started another blog called Codey McCoderson.wordpress.com. Like those are all very transparent places. I feel very fortunate that my math blog, I will still get people who find resources there that are useful for like new teachers. So that's actually another thing I would plug. I wish more computer science teachers blogged. Like in the math world, there's a huge math blogging community and Twitter community and ways to share resources, and really amazing like crowd-driven projects have come out of that. And there is not as strong a sense in the computer science world. There are definitely like some folks who blog out there have been doing it for a really long time, like Alfred Thompson, someone who's had a blog for like a really long time. But I would love to see like new voices in the CS blogging world of just like writing about, you know, things that you're trying out in your classroom, you know, how certain lessons went, you know, strategies that you're using, and building that community, I think is really cool. There's another teacher I really like, and her blog's is really funny. It's STEMinist in the Classroom. That's Katie O'Brien, and she's got a really fun blog name too. So yeah, I would also plug blogging. Like folks should make blogs and build that sense of community around writing and get on Twitter. If you're a new computer science teacher, I'd say get on Twitter, 100%. Sarah Judd said that too. I was just listening to that episode, and I would echo everything that they said.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Dan. So I've worked with Dan over the last couple of years through Arizona's CSTA chapter. We're both on the board of directors, and I have certainly enjoyed getting to know him and learn from him. If you got a friend or colleague who would benefit from listening to this interview, please consider sharing it with them. Otherwise, stay tuned next week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode, and 2 weeks now for another interview. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and are having a wonderful week. Thank you again.